Hi there, folks. Welcome to another exciting edition of Israel Explained on YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about a crisis that's emerging in the cabinet and in its relations with the army about the future of the military campaign. Now, it's important to make a caveat here. Wars always reach these points where it's unclear what the next move will be and there are arguments. So I'm not trying to say that this is necessarily going to derail the entire war or some kind of massive problem with the campaign. But what I am saying is that right now it's not clear what direction the campaign is going in, and that right now is harming to some extent the effectiveness of the operation. My hope is that these problems can be solved and solved soon. So let's get into what I'm talking about. So as we know, Israel and the United States have been talking throughout this campaign about the idea of lowering the intensity of the conflict at some point. A lot of dates have been thrown around, but what Israel seems to have arrived at by basically pushing the American date as far as possible is the end of January. That's where currently the plans are to lower the intensity of the conflict. At that point, according to the plan, Israel would start using elite units in order to target the most sensitive areas of the Gaza Strip. Um, but there's a growing call among many people, especially former military in the Knesset and former military analysts, to move to that lower phase of conflict now. The advocates for that in the cabinet are Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, who represent the left-wing or center-left Zionist camp in the government. Both of them say that they believe that the IDF is not accomplishing the main goals of the war through this kind of intensity. And they also are arguing that there's a lack of marginal utility in the amount of force that Israel is using. Israel is currently working to confront and destroy entire brigades. And that means hunting down every last person with a gun or RPG, and while these targets are not particularly militarily important, they are killing Israeli soldiers. Most of the meetings between Hamas terrorists and IDF soldiers go Israel's way, the vast majority. But the more of those meetings there are, the more often Israeli soldiers get killed and hurt. And the argument is Israel could be achieving about as much, or maybe a little bit less, with a more concentrated blow by better units with more firepower behind it and losing less soldiers. Another thing that Gantz and Eisenkot are concerned about is that a lot of Israeli soldiers are sitting around occupying territory because the amount of territory Israel is occupying at this point is vast. It's well over half of the Gaza Strip, and are therefore functioning as sitting ducks. In a leak from the cabinet, Eisenkot said there is no reason to keep entire brigades in hostile territory. And of course, the IDF is already working on this issue. We talked yesterday about the strip that will be severing Gaza into half around where El Borej is. And the idea is that that will be a safe zone where the military can stand without being sitting ducks, and then move into areas of Gaza at will. So that's some of the idea behind this. Um, the Another element that they're concerned about is that progress now is very slow, and that the progress could be faster with targeted strikes. Um, there's a couple of reasons why this fight is coming up now. One is there's a lot of intensity of dislike between Netanyahu and Gantz. That's nothing new. But as we know, there's been a conflict over the appointment of prison head the prison chief, and the extension of the appointment of the chief of police. It had been promised Gantz when he entered the government that those individuals would be extended in their role. And meanwhile, Ben-Gvir, who's in charge of the prison services and the police, is trying to replace them both. And Netanyahu is supporting Ben-Gvir, or at least was supporting Ben-Gvir on that replacement. There's a lot of talks now about some kind of compromise or something, but that has soured relations between Gantz and Netanyahu, and that seems to be spilling over into the security field as well. But there's another more important issue here, something that people aren't talking about that much. Even though the IDF planned to escalate this war until the end of January, they also believed that at some point before that they would be stopped by a hostage deal. The Israeli assumption up until a few days ago was that a hostage deal through Qatar would be negotiated, leading to the release of 40 highly sensitive hostages and maybe more. But things have changed. The Hamas has announced that it doesn't want to pursue another partial hostage deal. It regrets the last one. Egypt has offered a sort of plan to end the entire conflict, and Hamas really wants to go with ending the entire conflict. So it looks like a hostage deal is currently off the table. And that means that Israel actually controls its own destiny in terms of what it does over the next month, something that it didn't think that it would be able to do. So now, with it having more room to maneuver, these arguments are coming to the fore. Um, but as it stands, there's no decision on that, and the IDF is frustrated because it's hard for the IDF to plan what it's going to do when it doesn't know if it's trying to escalate or if it's trying to de-escalate. Those would call for a completely different setup of the troops, and they would also call for different targets to focus on right now. So it's very important that the IDF know where this operation is going ASAP. As it stands, the individuals who want to continue the escalation have the majority in the cabinet. Netanyahu is one of them, and the defense minister Gallant is another, and also the chief of staff Herzi Halevi wants to escalate. And speaking of the chief of staff, the army has increasingly shown reservations or even criticism, not open criticism, this is leaks, but is increasingly voicing criticism of how this war is being run by the cabinet. These are some of the things that they're concerned about. First, they're increasingly worried about the entry of fuel into the Gaza Strip. Not so much the other humanitarian aid, not that they're necessarily uh, huge fans of the amount of humanitarian aid that's coming in, but it's the fuel that really bothers them. That fuel is going directly at this point to Hamas because Hamas controls Rafah, and then they're using it to kill Israeli soldiers. To the IDF, that's insane. To me, that's also insane. On a related note, the IDF wants to move down and take over Rafah and the Philadelphia route. The Philadelphia route being the border between Gaza and Egypt. And that's, of course, because if Israel controlled that area, it would be able to distribute the fuel on its own. So right now, the IDF would prefer that no fuel come in. If any fuel does come in, it wants to be able to control it by taking over Rafah. And if you saw my last video, I agree with him wholeheartedly that Rafah needs to be taken sooner rather than later. The army also believes that one of the reasons Hamas is toughening its position now vis-a-vis a hostage release and vis-a-vis ending the war is because the leadership in Qatar feels relatively safe. Sure, there have been some threats to their lives, but basically it's been decided that in order not to disrupt negotiations, Israel's not going to target them right now. The IDF feels like that should change, and the Mossad should be going after them in order to put pressure on them. And I think certainly if they are fearful for their lives, that would be useful for negotiations. Another concern the IDF has, and I have, and the United States has, is the lack of a plan for the day after. The heads of the security services, the IDF, the Shabak, the Mossad, wanted to meet with Netanyahu 3 times already to talk about the day after, and he refused. The reasons are obvious. It's not because Netanyahu doesn't think that it's important to discuss what the day after will look like. It's that he's worried that it will be leaked, and everything gets leaked nowadays, and that it will make him look bad politically when he starts talking about bringing in officials who will be PA officials, right? One of the things that we learned from things like the de-Baathization of Iraq is that when you remove all experienced officials from a position for ideological reasons, it's very hard to run a country. So it's expected that bureaucrats with experience will be used to run Gaza in some kind of technocratic government in the day after, some sort of transition government. And that would look very bad for Netanyahu. It would show that he's bringing the PA back, at least in some limited way, after he promised he wouldn't. It will give ammunition to his critics like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, etc. But the problem is there's no political vision. There's no way the IDF can prepare for the day after, and this plays into the hands of Hamas. Hamas is retaining political control in Rafah, as we discussed in the last video, and political control over the vast majority of the population. And Israel isn't offering them any scope for the future, anything aside from occupation under the IDF. So it's two very bad options presented for the Palestinians. Continue to live under Hamas, live under IDF occupation without a civil government, and for many of them, they prefer Hamas. At least it's their own bastards instead of the Zionist bastards, so to speak. I think that both sides on this debate are wrong in a sense. I agree with Netanyahu and Halevi that continuing to escalate the war is important. However, that escalation shouldn't just be willy-nilly to any neighborhood. That escalation needs to be focused on two things right now. Taking all of Han Yunis above ground and taking Rafah and the Philadelphia route. That requires an escalation that can be done by the end of January, but it needs to start happening now. And why do I say that the Netanyahu side is also wrong? Because they're not offering a political and diplomatic scope for the future. The bottom line is right now Israel is at war. And if you want to win a war, you need to be aggressive. You need to be aggressive militarily, but you also need to be aggressive diplomatically. Israel needs to shape the day after. Israel needs to shape the diplomatic uh, scope of where these things are going so that other forces, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, don't shape it for Israel. And the more Israel succeeds militarily, the more say it has in what comes the day after. The more power Hamas has, the less power Israel does. So those things match. Israel needs to be aggressive everywhere. Israel needs to set its agenda everywhere, politically and militarily. You need to be assertive in both ways, and it looks like one side doesn't want to be assertive enough in one way, and the other side doesn't want to be assertive enough in the other. Hopefully, they'll overcome these problems and continue the war. Overall, this war has been a success, but right now, it's just not clear where it's going, and there is a lot of opportunities to botch the landing in this operation. So we'll be reporting on that here closely. As usual, great questions from all of you. Um, M. Sidloy asks, Shael, won't a de-intensification that leaves Sinwar and Daif unscathed and leaves Hamas able to operate in parts of Gaza be perceived by the Arab street as a capitulation or a loss by Israel and as a victory by Hamas? Yes. Not only will it be perceived by the Arab street as a victory for Hamas, it would be a victory for Hamas. That's my main concern when I keep talking about Rafah. My concern is Israel will escalate all over the place, and Hamas will remain in Rafah, and then Israel will move over to the low intensity side with Hamas still in charge of the vast majority of the population in Gaza. I wouldn't call that a complete and total massive victory for Hamas, but close enough. And Israel has made Sinwar and Deif symbols and talked a lot about killing them, and now if it doesn't kill them, that looks like a defeat too. So that's why Israel has to escalate, has to hunt these people down, has to make sure that Rafah doesn't remain under Hamas control, and all that will back a, like I said, diplomatic um, solution. for the future of Gaza. But yeah, you're right. Israel hasn't won the war militarily yet, and when you don't defeat a guerrilla organization, the guerrilla organization wins. Israel cannot afford to not win this war. Even if the price is high, the war has to be won. Abby Pinsker asks, in a post-war environment, or a different phase of the war maybe, how does the rebuild of Gaza work? How involved will Israel be in building homes, hospitals, etc., in Gaza? And how do they work with other parties, i.e. the UN, to do so? Well, thanks for the question, Abby. I would be in a better position to answer this if Israel was holding these meetings about the day after and they weren't constantly being canceled. I just saw that Netanyahu said that he would hold the meeting like this in a few days, so hopefully he will. It certainly looks bad that he's not. But so all I can do is estimate what Israel will do. You're talking about building homes, hospitals, etc. I don't think Israel's going to be all that involved in it. It may provide some money, it may provide some technical know-how. It's not going to be doing the heavy lifting in terms of funding and building. Um, One of the reasons is, Israel, it's not going to be politically popular for Israel to spend a lot of money in Gaza. It's not going to be politically popular in Gaza for Israel to be responsible for the rebuilding. And it might actually play into the hands of Iran and others if it looks like Israel is trying to take control there as some sort of permanent occupation. Instead, most likely, the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip will be funded by a combination of the United States, EU, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, and maybe to a lesser extent, Egypt. And the nice thing about that, from the Israeli perspective, is it removes Iranian influence as much as possible. What Israel has done in the past is it's allowed Qatar to rebuild Gaza after attacks, and that has just deepened the um, hold that Iran and Hamas have over the Gaza Strip. So that's how it's going to be. Israel's going to be very weary about bringing in UN organizations, especially UNRWA, and others that have been tarnished by cooperation with terrorism. So I think there's going to be, no matter who the Israeli prime minister is, whether it's Netanyahu or Gantz in the future, they're going to try to prevent the UN from having too much of a hold. I hope they succeed. That might be difficult. So Israel's going to work with those countries that and organizations that it kind of trusts, might try to keep the UN out of it. Israel will have to coordinate with all these other actors very closely because Israel is going to be responsible for security, at least in the near future. So, in that sense, the IDF will be like the peacekeepers there, um, or at least that's how they will want to be seen, and they'll be cooperating and keeping the security while others rebuild the strip. That again is problematic from a political point of view in Gaza, which might embolden and strengthen Hamas, but Israel really has no choice. It can't allow its security to be farmed out to anyone else because, as we know, no one else will protect Israelis. No one else has the political will and the ability to do that but the IDF. Okay, so thank you again for watching. If you like what we do here, support us on Patreon at Shael Media and check out my podcast, History of the Land of Israel podcast. I'll see you here again tomorrow.